on the previous class, we went on to look at several of these systemic disorders. I did actually focus a lot on some of the systemic ones, and the idea was that not only it is tied very well with some of the stuff that we've been discussing during class quite a bit on the cardiovascular side and kidneys, but this is really the ones that, you know, is also somewhat tied with inflammation. We did go about some cellular changes, some tissue changes there on all the way from edema to little types of hemorrhage. But the idea, again, yes, it is interesting, it is good that you know those types, but it's even more interesting that you tie with the bigger picture of things. Inflammation, then, we could have actually this class of inflammation even during immunology or stress physiology and so on. But also is such a big portion of, you know, of pathology that I decided to leave here. Number one, every time, and when we were talking about some of those other changes in such as edema or even hemorrhage, it is somewhat, you know, we try to dissect those things, but they are somewhat together. You know, every time you have edema, you probably have some degree of inflammation, okay? Unless, is every edema caused by inflammation? No. Remember when we were talking about osmotic pressure. You don't have enough proteins, all of a sudden you have fluids going from the vascular bed to the interstitial space, and all of a sudden you have edema. It's not caused by inflammation. Is this going to cause inflammation? May likely cause inflammation, because all of a sudden you have so much fluid outside or inside the interstitial space that will cause some damage and will cause some inflammation there. So, but overall speaking, inflammation will occur either because of trauma or because of an external agent. When you talk about trauma, what do you think is that what causes, what is in trauma that causes inflammation to you? You hit your head against the wall, or, you know, mad at me, freaking Ronaldo, doing all this thing, hit your head against the wall. And then you start having this bump in your forehead. What is causing the bump in your forehead? Burst of little vessels. What else? Probably when you hit your head against the wall, you'll probably kill the few cells, you know, by smashing, by doing stuff. And you remember, by having all that stuff popping out in the interstitial space, will probably cause some cells to come in. Inflammation will almost always be triggered by anything that disrupts that very nice homeostatic way of running things. You know, cells intact, vascular bed in extremely and nicely pressured place, oxygenation okay. Anything else can cause some degree of inflammation. Even things that don't necessarily, and this is the stuff that is coming out more and more, that the kind of inflammation that kills us the most is not even this kind of acute inflammation. It's more the chronic sort of inflammation. So, you know, all that stress, all that crazy lifestyle, all that not eating well, not sleeping well, you're always in a state of either stress or mild inflammation. That kills you by the thousands, you know, in terms of, you know, how different. And the problem with studying chronic inflammation is exactly that. For us, it's kind of a weird topic because it doesn't necessarily changes your cardiovascular system. It doesn't necessarily changes your kidney output. It doesn't necessarily change how your immune system works. It just kills you slowly. And it is important that you know chronic inflammation, absolutely. That is going to really be the topic of this kind of discussion probably now. Okay, but it's important to have this sense. So you do have, like, all these things that we're going to see in the next few slides are really actually the classic, you know, kind of description of some of the inflammatory process that you have. So by the time you do have some injury, either by a tissue damage or by an external agent, it means that something in that region, and hopefully it's in that region only, although we can know that, sometimes, for example, bacteria can spread all over your body, and you have this thing that we saw in last class is called septicemia, so it's like bacteria all over. Normally, when you have things all over, you are in trouble, okay, you have problems. But for the most part, it's almost localized. You have inflammation more or less localized in your body. So basically what it tries to do, in the previous one, there was a little line saying to localize and isolate. And a lot of the stuff that happens all the way from swollen and migration of defense cells to the site of infection, what the body is trying to do is isolate. And what about when you form an abscess, which is like that pus encapsulated? What is trying to do? What is the body trying to do there? It's trying to isolate the thing. But in that case, it tried to isolate in a certain way that after a certain point, he wasn't able to actually get rid of that thing. So he basically isolated and left in there. Okay, grows. It's that thing. Sometimes it's, the only way to cure that is for you to cut it and try to remove physically. But basically what you do have is migration and activation of these leukocytes. The systemic response, the activation and migration of leukocytes, they can be local too. Do you have things that will go to the systemic or activation of systemic reactions? Probably so, especially if the injury is somewhat traumatic. So you're going to have for example, your stress response triggered. You can have all the stuff from adrenaline coming out of your adrenal glands. You can have cortisol, and being released also for the adrenal gland and cause some other changes. But the systemic response, one that is probably could be more related to the inflammation is one, for example, fever. You may have an infection of your lungs, but fever is a systemic response. So probably, it's not probably, fever is already known for being caused by some of the inflammatory mediators. More specifically, for example, prostaglandin E is one of those that go to your brain and changes the thermostat of your body. And by changing the thermostat of your body, it's trying to do something that perhaps will help you. Okay? So when you think about fever, and this, when we get to the class of treatments, anti-inflammatories, you will see one thing, for example, do you think fever is good? Think about it. You trigger something, it is triggered by the immune response, and you're like, oh, you have fever. There must be a reason why you have fever. Okay? Why do you increase your baseline temperature by 1 or 2 degrees Celsius? You go from 36, maybe 37 to 38, 39. Bad cases, 40 or more. Okay? And it has a reason for that. We're going to get to that, but this is a type of systemic response caused by a local response, a localized inflammation that caused a systemic response. Okay. And this is one of those cases where inflammation, and that goes along with the fever. The problem with inflammation, I said 2 examples. One is fever. Oh, is it good or bad? And the other example that I gave is the chronic or the acute nature of the inflammation. And ties up with during class, in the immunology class, you remember when I said that, it is so important to activate your immune system on time. That's why you have, for example, your acquired immune system, your adaptive immune system, that in future infections by the same agent, you can act very fast. It's about speed. It's about how fast you act. The problem with, and this is I was saying, like, this is the importance of acting fast. But I think I mentioned several times that with the immune system, as important as acting fast is to deactivate at some point. Because if you keep inflamed, either from an acute standpoint or a chronic standpoint, the inflammation itself can be as bad as the disease or the origin of that inflammation. Okay? So that's why people ask, Ronaldo, what is the point of having cortisol? Every time you have inflammation, eventually you get stressed, and you will release cortisol. And we know that cortisol is the primary anti-inflammatory in your body. That's how we found anti-inflammatory drugs. Okay? And you see, that doesn't make any sense. It does because the body perceives inflammation as a bad thing as well. Theoretically, the perfect scenario is an agent come in, you have a very fast response, and disappear with that. Okay, that would be the perfect way in which every immune system and situation would work. This redness, yes, heat, swelling, pain, loss, all of these, in many ways, is basically related to one thing, which is the migration to a certain area. By the time you migrate stuff, fluids and cells to a certain area, yes, you're going to swell that area. You're going to produce quite a bit of heat because of that. And by swelling something, in many of the tissues, by the time you swell, you activate nociceptors or receptors of pain, from your ending of terminal nerves, and then you're going to cause pain. Okay, so this is bread and butter for inflammation. Yeah.
A little bit random, but I was just wondering why some bruises are painful and some aren't.
Some bruises are painful, some bruises aren't. That's a good question. Sometimes, when you have you have sometimes a very deep cut, and it is painful, but those that are really tiny, those are even worse. And I think it has to do with nerves that are around. Sometimes it's areas that are more sensitive. I wouldn't know. It's a good question. I think it has to do, one thing that is, I think, the most glaring, for example, of pain. Now we're deviating a little bit of pain, is when you have, and it's actually one of the case studies that we're going to do in the digestive, but I'm going to tell you right away anyway. So it is, if you have swelling, normally in almost every tissue, even tissues that have lumen, have a hole in the middle, it causes pain. If you have something that is just like it's not swelling, but it's cut, sometimes it doesn't cause you pain, and that's because of the way in which the nerve system, the peripheral nerve system, is actually attached to a certain organ or to a certain tissue. So intestines is one of those good examples. You feel a lot of pain when you're not feeling well, or you have some agent there, salmonella, call it whatever that is because you have gas being produced. And that thing, your stomach or your intestine, most of the time your intestine, it fills. That stretching of the tissue causes you pain. If you go there and you cut it, you stop feeling pain. You're going to be screwed, but you stop feeling pain. So pain is one of those things that it depends on where you feel it and the type of injury you have. Okay? You may have things that causes way more pain than others, and they're not necessarily as bad as it is. Okay? So So acute inflammation, this is, listen, this is the stuff that is really what we've been talking so far. So immediate and early response in vascular caliber alteration, which basically means you're going to have vasodilation, plasma protein and leukocyte circulation, they leave the circulation, and you're going to see that leukocytes we already knew. But normally with the plasma that goes, you're going to see that, there's one type of inflammation that we, again, go back to the class or the case study of the heart. You have that kind of a yellowish sort of almost pus-like things around the heart that we saw in the pictures. That is not only a little bit of leukocytes and debris of cells that are there. Fibrin tends to be one thing that, with the leukocytes, it goes with some other larger protein. And one of the reasons why you have that is the following. Fibrin, or not even fibrin, let's talk about, your regular tissues. Lots of things inside of you are done or are disposed in layers. Sometimes you have your organ and you have a cirrhosis. Cirrhosis is that little membrane that goes really around every organ that you have. And around the abdominal cavity, you have the peritoneum, which is a little membrane that basically surrounds your abdominal cavity. And one of the reasons is like anatomical and physical, so you compact organs in a certain way. But the other one is that what you're trying to do, your body is always trying to create layers. Why? Because once you have an infection, if you have several layers, it's more difficult for the infection to spread. You have more like a physical barrier to keep or isolate something. And fibrin tends to do exactly that. So for example, abscess, obviously we didn't see what an abscess is, but abscess is like an encapsulated inflammation. You have pus inside, and what forms that little ball of grossness, is fibrin. Why? Because you tend to localize and you tend to isolate. So this is one of those things that inflammation tends to do. All these things. Tissue necrosis, chemical and physical agents with trauma is one of these physical agents, infections, viral, bacterial, fungi, prion, whatever type of agents that can cause infection, and toxins. Toxins that can be of microbial nature or can be of chemical nature, whatever that is. And all of this can trigger inflammation. How does it trigger inflammation? Go back to the immunology class, and everything that is non-self will end up being there. Okay? Why there are some more potent than others? That sometimes has to do with the idea that, yes, do we acquire a lot of, like, our library of antigens in our immune system grows as we grow older, because we are exposed to more stuff, okay? But you were born with a set number of agents in that library. How were you born with this thing? Because we have a few million years of evolution, and all of a sudden, it didn't take long for your body to understand that, there are certain toxins for certain bacteria that is bad for you. You don't have to learn that that thing is bad for you. Lots of people before died for us because of that. They said, hey, it's bad. So let's start including that in your DNA, and say, yes, we're going to recognize that. And this is really how it is. When you go, for example, and study a little bit more in depth that major histocompatibility complex, which is one of those major mechanisms by which you recognize self and non-self stuff, it's a major portion of your chromosomes. There is one or two chromosomes that are like filled with this major histocompatibility complex. Think about this. You have 20, 21, and all of a sudden you have like You have to grow tissues, you have to have systems, you have to control everything, but you have a big portion of one of those just for that. That's how important this recognition of stuff is, and this is how important it was through the development of humans, or basically any superior animal, to have that library of things. So you do understand that. So all of this is there. You're born with a big amount, and you acquire another big amount. Okay? Okay. So vascular changes, yeah. So you know all of this protein-rich fluid. If you have to understand one of these proteins, fibrin is one, to pay attention to or to know. And you have some types of these fluids. Again, do you remember that when I was talking about cellular changes, pathological changes, and there's aqueous and there's a little one, and I said, yes, the cells, they act differently once they start getting injured, and you have some of them, they start secreting or they start accumulating metalloid substances, others more like fat, some others more like water type, and eventually you're going to have some of that being some of those cells will die, so you're going to have that content coming out. And also your vascular, normally what you have in this case is during inflammation, you have this permeability that is increased. So you're going to have that mesh of fluid once you have a certain injury. And the grosser the fluid, the worse is the infection. So if it is just more like aqueous, bad, but probably okay. When you see more like fluid, clear light, one thing that you can probably assume is that there are less cells, there is less protein, meaning probably inflammation is less severe. Okay? By the time you go into this is what you would call transudate, exudate, and purulent. And this, what you can see here, you call different names, but this is just a progression. Okay? As the thing becomes, as I said, grosser and grosser, sounds really weird, and I don't want to touch it, to actual pus, which is get away from me kind of reaction. That is when you start having you have at least the idea that thing is bad. Okay? Does it mean that, one of those is going to be better than the other? Like the pus one is going to be always worse on a systemic side? Not necessarily, because you can have this widespread, or you compare to this isolated. If you have this isolated, probably better. Why? Because you are dealing with a more localized type of infection, more inflammation. But from the cell point of view, yes, from better to worse. Okay? Okay, so the acute inflammation side, the cellular events, this is more or less the same as the immune class, but this just talking about how these leukocytes leave the vascular bed towards the interstitial space. They have to migrate. They are in the blood. They're going to have to attach to endothelial cells in the vessels. They're going to have to somewhat migrate to the inside. You have some type of adhesion of these molecules to the vascular bed, but then you have something that is calling them. During our class, cytokines are the ones that will call. So you do have the inflammation. They don't leave the vessels, white blood cells, out of nowhere. They don't have to, unless either a non-inflammatory way for them to do that is when, for example, you remember that some of the monocytes will become then later macrophages. So they are monocytes in blood, and they leave to become macrophages in tissues like sentinel cells and da. So this would be like a non-inflammatory migration. You're going to have some cells doing that. But when you have mass migration, it has to be, almost 100% of the time, it has to be associated with an infection, okay? And then by the time this portion here, yes, phagocytosis. Phagocytosis, immune class. Recognition of what is self, non-self, binding of the receptor. Oh, you're not from here. Neutrophil goes there and kills you. Oh, if it is not you, they present to another cell. The cell becomes a mounts an immune reaction against you, and then you can have either a cell or a humoral response. So that's on the immune cell class. This is just a picture talking about, you know, how does it go from the vascular bed binding to the vessel, and then eventually migrating, and then being called by chemokines or cytokines against the microbes. Once it eats the microbes, it frees or liberates more cytokines that brings more cells to it, and then becomes a cycle. And then the more killing and the more cells that are here, more cytokines, more cells come. Okay? How, when I say this mass migration, how big can that be? And I say it can be enormous. Okay? When you have like large infections, you can basically deplete the amount of white blood cells in your body, in your blood, just because they came all the way to the site of infection. One example that is not even an infection or a pathological circumstance, but parturition. Parturition, you're going to have like this somewhat traumatic event. You have the offspring, and all of a sudden you have, listen, you have the passage of a baby through the birth canal, and almost, especially in domestic species, almost always you're going to have some degree of inflammation of the uterus. Not only because it's so much more exposed to the external environment, so you have some degree of infection, but also because you're going to have to turn that big uterus into a smaller uterus, because it's going to have to go back to the original size, or somewhat the original size. So what's happened? Who's going to do that? Your immune system. So if you see blood from an animal that is before pregnancy and the day after pregnancy or a week, you're going to see that the number of white blood cells in the blood before is enormous, and all of a sudden it gets depleted all of a sudden. That's why it's also a time where the female becomes very susceptible to infections. Why? Because it has used lots of those cells. One of the ways, for example, for you to understand or know that your immune system has been depleted is, one, you have a much lower number in the blood. Having a lower number in the blood is not necessarily bad. It means that you have used your population to fight something. But once you start having young, immature leukocytes in blood, that means that, you know, you're pushing. You're having this stimulus to have white blood cells coming off, but they are not even ready yet to be there. So this is one of the ways on clinical pathology. Clinical pathology is the fancy name for laboratory, you know, people that work in laboratory analysis, is once they do leucograms, once they try to look at, you know, your white blood cell profile, you remember during the immune cell, you have like neutrophils is supposed to comprise a certain proportion, and then you have monocytes is just a little bit, and eosinophils is just a little bit. It's because not only allergies, we know that basophils and xenophils might go up. If you have parasite infection, eosinophils probably go up. So you have some of those very clear indications, but also the number of those cells. If you start having cells that are not supposed to be there, or you see cells that are, oh, this looks like a neutrophil, but this looks like a neutrophil that is like, it should be in the medulla yet, still developing. And it means that, you know, you're probably starting to have some condition that is probably using all those white blood cells as it probably shouldn't be. Okay. Okay, so this is the stuff, like types of acute inflammation: serous, fibrinous. Again, most of the time, serous is going to be like more of that water-like kind of inflammation. Fibrinous is going to be more like you have a little bit more of this fibrin, so you course of fibrinous inflammation. Yes, they call this bread and butter, which is gross, but as you start forming those, if you could get in some tissues inside of you, and you could get this fibrinous inflammation, you see some sort of net being formed, kind of little, these large molecules, they get together and they form somewhat of a net. And you're starting to get close to be, or to form, or it's starting to get severe enough that you're soon going to form pus, but it's not there yet. Okay? But again, this fibrin is good because it isolates. Okay, it tries to isolate, but still appears not very good. Purulent, sometimes they call suppurative, large amounts of pus. The pus can be in certain types, sometimes is encapsulated. You have other types of, you know, that you don't call abscess, but is, you know, this pus can or cannot be encapsulated. Sometimes you have pus, especially in muscles, that is common. You have the pus just not encapsulated, but you have spread over large areas, especially because of trauma, and followed by infection. Okay? And catarrhal, this is very common for upper respiratory tract. So don't need to mention, but yes, when you have one of the bad flus or bad bacterial infections in the upper respiratory tract, you start to have very weird secretions. Okay? That secretion is the result of an inflammation that became, and you can see, you know, probably the upper respiratory tract is a good example for us. Once it's in the beginning, you start to have lots of, you know, mucus, but the beginning is clear. Okay? It doesn't look so bad. And then you start to get really bad, and then you start to get a little bit more, I shouldn't say pus, it almost never for us gets pus-like, but it gets in this catarrhal kind of, so you can see that it's not clear. It has probably lots more fibrin and cells, and that's where it starts to. So anytime you start to have more cells and more proteins, large proteins, force. This is just the names of it. These are just the names of it. Very good. This is, you know, part of the stuff that I already talked. You know, so if you go to, for example, fibrin formation, avoid bacterial spread and enhances leukocyte activity by localization. Okay, this is basically the idea or the function of fibrin. When you have those exudates, you know, and you have that, you know, constant, you know, recycling or the cells start to accumulate stuff and they burst, and the idea for that is that you can dilute stuff. You can dilute bacteria, you can dilute toxins. Hopefully that is being picked up by either the bloodstream or the lymph system, and then going out, you know, either for one of the excretion, you know, basically pathways, feces, urine, whatever. So what you're trying to do is to dilute and remove, dilute and remove. Dilution and removal, although these in internal organs will happen probably at a slower pace, if you talk about, or if you think about upper respiratory tract, urinary tract, and digestive tract, is one of the major ways by which you defend yourself. So when you have vomiting, diarrhea, when you have, for example, large, copious amounts of secretion coming out of your lungs and your upper respiratory tract, what you're trying to do is get rid of. Thank goodness you can get rid of that. Okay? You can remove a big portion of it. Reason why, every time you get sick, doctor tells you to do what? Number one, drink water like crazy. Because normally these exudates and these cellular injuries, they consume a lot of water. Okay? You have to have a lot of water to do that. So by the time you get sick, the more water you have inside of you, or less deficit of water, the better. Antibodies in this plasma mediator system complement coagulation. These are somewhat, I think these two here are more important for the sake of this class, or for the sake of the thing that we're talking right now. Then you have protective antibodies, plasma mediators, and this promotion of immunity. Yeah, you know, you will have those things being, being done by the immune system, okay? The other two, the nice thing about the other two, dilution and fibrin, is that we have never talked about those things before. The other three here, protective antibodies, plasma mediator, and promotion of immunity, this is basically what your immune system will do, okay? It's not a big deal. Cell nutrition, I think this portion here, what you bringing glucose and oxygen is probably the, especially glucose is the most important. The glucose and oxygen here will be important because your immune system, first of all, the metabolism of the cells that are being injured, at some point, as they try to fight, they consume a lot more. But the most important thing is your immune system. By the time you have activation, all those things that the migration of the cell through the blood, entering the interstitial space, producing cytokines, bringing more cells, producing more cells in medulla. It's an animal during an infection. Your immune system can consume up to 30% of the energy you have available. So imagine all of a sudden going from a very small amount of energy being consumed by your immune system to 30% of what you consume. A lot, okay? And it has to be, this is one of the reasons why almost all of the hormones that are related to stress or inflammation, such as cortisol, adrenaline, for example, they tend to be what? In the case of cortisol, is a glucocorticoid. Adrenaline also does the same thing for glucose. It tends to bump the amount of glucose you have in the bloodstream. Why? Because most of the time, the consumption of energy in your body will go up. Okay? So trying to keep those things. On the exudates, dilution, metabolic activity, lots of water, consumption of energy through the immune system, lots of glucose. That's why during sickness, consuming a lot of water, resting, because by resting you're not spending energy by doing things that are not, shouldn't be prioritized at that point, and actually trying to eat a little bit is key. Even before we go into the super acquired immune system and all the endocrine changes, you see, this is the point. It's not just by, you're feeling better. You have to have that. Okay? Very good. So now we're gonna go. This is gonna be like, it's basically, I'm not gonna be touching too much. Like, it's a prolonged inflammatory process, weeks or months, sometimes years, where an active inflammation, tissue destruction, attempt to repair proceeding simultaneously. So basically, chronic inflammation is something that can be an allergy that you don't know. People think about people that have celiac disease. So they have an allergy to gluten. The other day and I don't know if this is true, but I think it is, because from the people that I know that have had or that do have celiac disease, they normally take years to find out. Why? Because all of a sudden you, out of nowhere, you start to not feeling well, you have diarrhea, you have, constipation, you have whatever, you have lots of things that is not going right, and you cannot. How would you know? Is because of the bread you're eating. So it is kind of a state until you find out where you are in constant inflammation. You're always exposed. In that case, because of an allergy, because of one molecule there. In that case, one protein, glutamine or gluten, is not good for you, or you have an inflammatory reaction for that. So this would be a persistent kind of reaction. In this case, you would fall into what we say here, autoimmunity. So any of those things, people that work in mines for too long, they always aspirate those bad, either toxins or particles that are in the air. And your lungs, for example, are recurrently exposed to the same stuff. So your lungs are almost always inflamed. You're trying to alleviate, and you're trying to alleviate and try to go back. And that's normally this is the classical examples of a chronic inflammation. And then more modernly today, especially in humans, is this acute, and I don't know what would be the technical term that they call for this chronic inflammation that is like weak chronic inflammation, that you're always, and you don't necessarily have that type of stimulus like gluten or particles in the mind, but it's because of your state of stress. And that state of stress triggers inflammation in your body. So this is another way of looking at inflammation. Yes, I'm sorry.
So having glucose or basically eating helps with immunity, right? So why is it that with certain conditions you lose your appetite?
Well, this is it's a good question, because once you have fever, and normally it's associated not necessarily with fever itself, but once you're sick, it's not that your body in terms of is trying to prioritize. Body tries to prioritize more like resting than actual desire to eat. Because the desire to eat, by the time you're feeling pain and stuff, is almost like, it's not like you. And one question would be true. Like, I don't know if it has a direct impact on your hunger center, or if it's just like the pain and not feeling well and the fever just overloads, and you end up not. So you have to basically force yourself to eat. But it's a good question. But I would say it's probably partly both. You probably have some molecules there, some of those inflammatory mediators that may just go to centers in, all these things, the hunger center, the temperature center, the emotion, they are all in the same kind of spot in the middle of your brain, emotions even. So the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, or the thalamus, all of those things are around the same space. So very often one affects the other, but I wouldn't know specifically which one. So that's what it is. So it's persistent. Yes, you do have like all these things. Macrophages, they tend to be like this kind of cells of chronic inflammation, because the macrophages is what we call like those sentinel cells, those cells that are around your body trying to see what's going on. They call one of those antigen presenting cells as well. They can phagocytize, but they also present cells to the acquired system. And normally when you have that thing, in general, you have an increased amount, either in blood of monocytes, because it is the precursor for macrophages, or in tissues. You go to the tissue, do a cytology or a biopsy, and you're going to see more of those cells. Very good. So, good ones in terms of systemic effect. I told you before, fever. All of this here becomes, it's kind of, sort of a diagram of fever. Generally speaking, yes, your center, your temperature control is in the hypothalamus. But what basically here, and this is the one, the type of prostaglandin, you can see, you have an exogenous, antigen, immune cells, you have the response. Almost always for every inflammatory response, prostaglandin, for example, is one of the mediators, and this prostaglandin E2. I think we didn't go over like the specifics of inflammation. It's going to be important at some point that we know a little bit of the cascade of inflammation, and probably you have heard about these leukotrienes, prostaglandins, eicosanoids. This is the large family class of molecules that are really kind of associated with inflammation. And prostaglandin E2 is one of them. Prostaglandins in general. Those of you in the repro that have done the repro class, remember prostaglandin Act2 alpha that is for luteolysis is actually an inflammatory molecule too. Almost every cell in your body is able to produce prostaglandin of both types, F types, E types, but E type specifically is the one that goes to your hypothalamus and set the thermostat a little bit up. Okay? So it increases the temperature, the core temperature of your body. Those are the endocrine and metabolic responses, accused phase proteins, glucocorticoids, vasopressin. I think here the most important by far is the glucocorticoid because of not only the reason of increasing glucose, but it's going to be extremely important when we talk about anti-inflammatory effects, because it's going to be, that's the basis of that. Acute phase proteins are proteins that are produced by the liver in response to any sort of inflammation, and they have different, basically they have different functions. But for the most part, what those acute phase proteins try to do, they're producing relatively large amounts by the liver, and what they try to do is to some way limit the growth of external agents, especially certain types of bacteria. So they remove certain things from the blood, or they bind to certain things in the blood that are sometimes substrates, for bacterial growth. So what they do is they try to do that by they try to increase the production of that to limit external agent proliferation. Okay. And changes obviously in the cardiovascular system. For the most part, you have, when I say here redirection of the blood flow, this is basically this redirection to the site of infection. Okay, so you can have more blood going to a certain organ or to a certain region in your body, and basically speaking, you tend to have a little bit more of a pressure and rate increase, from the cardiovascular system. This portion here, increased numbers of, we talk about eosinophils going up because of parasite infection, infestations, or allergic reactions. In general, neutrophils go up because of bacteria. Lymphocytes go up. And when I say lymphocytes, especially like B and T cells or lymphocytes, they go up, and they tend to go up in viral infections as well, because that's one of the most effective ways to kill viruses. By really, you almost always have to trigger the acquired immune system, because just by the cells and the innate immune system from the immune system, they don't recognize well some of the stuff that happens just on the surface of the cells that are being, or have been infected by viruses. So they tend to be more or grow more towards the acquired immune system. And some of these things, weight loss, some of that, I think that might answer part of your question. You do have more, what you call, your metabolic rate in your body go up. Your immune system consumes a lot of energy. And yes, you will have some of the cytokines that may impair your appetite, how much you want to eat, so on. But in general, it's probably a combination of all. You consume less, you spend more, you lose weight. Okay. Pretty good. And with that, we are done. Okay. So this side of an inflammation, it is basically what we have, and together with this side of it, with your immune system class, you should have a very, very good basis for how your body tends to fight, some of the infections, and also at least some idea of different types of pathologies, how systemically your body may react. Your cells is important, a little less important than your systemic changes on your circulatory system as well. So the idea now is that from now on, what we're going to talk about is not organisms, but it's going to be either certain characteristics of the agents. For example, for next class, when we talk about bacteria and viruses, you'll see, yes, there are certain types of viruses, there are certain types of bacteria. No, for the most part, I'm going to try to talk a little bit interchangeably between that and treatments. Yes, we all know that antibiotics will not work for viruses. So what do you do for viruses? Today, 99% of the time, you wait for your body to do, and what you end up doing is try to avoid secondary infection. Okay, for bacteria, certain types of bacteria respond to certain types of antibiotics better. Anti-inflammatories. Inflammatories, is it good? Yes. Is it good all the time? No. Can you use for long periods of time? Probably not, because of secondary, probably collateral effect. Okay, so the idea for the next 2 or 3 classes is going to be to talk about some of that. So maybe we do have some time now to go over some of these these case studies, but I think what I'm going to do is basically go straight to this one here. Pretty easy. What do you call it? Let's go to this first. I was going to one of the endocrinology and digestive, but let's go to this on stress. I think it fits well to this one. Yes? The quiz.
What?
The quiz. You want to know where we're going to cover the quiz? Is that?
Oh, no. I'm doing research on stress in animals, and there's this paper that did physiological indicators of stress.
Yeah.
And they looked at the lymphocytes, so the neutrophilia, lymphocytosis, and the other ones I'm not going to attempt to pronounce.
Yeah.
And they said that the number of these increased, and that showed stress. How did those correlate?
So the number of some of these.
The neutrophilia, lymphocytes, and the other ones.
So but you're saying about your research.
Yeah. So it's about stress
in animals, and it's mainly about like animals in wildlife. So I'm just wondering how these numbers correlate to.
Like the numbers in, let's say, and this, a person has asked me this before. If you're talking about acute stress or acute inflammation, you're normally going to have an initial bump, but then you have your number in the bloodstream going down because the cells are going to the tissue. Okay, so does it mean that you are by having lower numbers of cells in the blood, does it mean that you have lower inflammatory reaction? No, because it might mean that just your cells are in the tissue doing what they are supposed to do. Okay. Now, what happens sometimes, for example, and it may be applied to the wildlife because of chronic stress, depending on the kind of imbalance they are, is that as you have your cortisol levels kind of always up, you basically deplete or you decrease the amount of cells you have. So you may have less, like neutrophilia, leukopenia. Every time it ends with penia, normally it means increase, or philia, sorry, neutrophilia, lymphophilia. But I have some other types. Sometimes neutropenia can mean lower number. So in your case, I think an alteration, it depends on the circumstance where you will collect. Okay.
It is an indicator of stress?
It could be. It could be. Yeah. So let's talk about, this is a very nice, basic, immune and stress physiology. So one is basically, we'll talk about cows, and we were talking about, heat stress, and, sometimes I do bring examples of my own world, to talk about. So heat stress is one of those that sometimes, you have animals that are really not adapted to certain conditions. So if you, in generally speaking, for example, in my case, if you put like Holstein cows, those black and white cows, produces large amounts of milk and so on, and you put them in tropical condition, if you don't provide them with what we call heat abatement strategies, they normally suffer. They will suffer because it is way out of their what they call thermoneutral condition. So for them, 5 degrees today's perfect for Holstein. They love it. Like 5, 10 degrees, whatever it is now, and they love it. Now they put them on 30 degrees. Yes, we suffer, but they suffer even more. Okay? So then you have all these things going on. In general, what do you think would happen there to feed intake if an animal is super stressed, especially heat stress? What do you think happens with your decreases? You have to think about yourself. Do you eat more in the winter or in the summer? All year round. Okay, but when? Where do you feel like eating heavier food? Probably winter, okay? But this is about not that you're stressed, but generally you tend to have more appetite when you're not under stress. Okay? Milk production, because of that, or partly because of that, will go down. Butter fat in general also go down, but this we might discuss this later. And reproduction tends to be very poor, okay, because of that. So then we're going to talk about, how you dissipate heat and, how you regulate your body temperature, because basically that's what it is. So this is the kind of stuff that it's, I remember when we were, I don't remember who even built this. I don't know if it was Augusto or Bruno before, some of my TAs. So the idea here is that you have to regulate your temperature. It is a source of stress, It's not the kind of stress that we were talking here. It can be disease, it can be stuff, but this is an environmental stress. Okay, and it's quite important. Do you think these animals will have some degree of reaction or some degree of response to their chronic stress or acute stress system similar to what we saw in class? So if you have to adapt or to somewhat relate to that, what was our stress system that we saw in class? What are the two major types? Let's use this to review a little bit what we learned so far. What would be the first one? Once you have stress, forget about the case. Let's talk about the class. When you talk about stress, the most immediate type of response from your body comes from what system? Yeah, well, it will be somewhat about, no, but I'm talking about, like, during class we talk about two systems. The sympathetic system, sympathetic medullary axis, SMA. The other one is the HPA. Okay, one tends to be more immediate, the other one tends to be more, it takes a little longer to trigger, but also they last a little longer. One have to do a lot with adrenaline release, neuroendocrine kind of response, but the other one is triggered then, or the major hormone then is cortisol. Okay, so when you think about those things, you're gonna have to start going. You see, you're gonna have to basically go into, and this is what the case studies for you will be. You go, yes, go ahead.
I don't think we actually touched on the stress lectures.
How come?
We did like the immunology sections, and then there was like a bottom half stress we have season 2. Yeah.
Did we skip the stress class?
I don't remember you talking much about stress.
If I did that, I don't believe I did that.
I think the last slide we talked about like the immune system communication between cells. That was the last.
Is this the slide I stopped?
Yeah.
Because that's where my computer says I stopped. I don't believe that. I don't believe we talked. We didn't go into stress physiology. Okay. We'll get there. I'm so sorry. You know what? In the repro class, I was skipping fertilization class. I went all the way from 1 to embryonic development. And I said, oops, people didn't get it. Okay, so we talk about cortisol, especially. You have an idea, but we're gonna go back there. I'm so sorry. So first of all, is like what kind of stress you are. We talk about heat stress, and especially in livestock, because it is such a big problem in many cultures that we do. Both beef cows, dairy cows, and swine, poultry. Poultry is a big deal. You have to control temperature quite well too. So basically, what you're trying to do is they generate a lot of heat, either from metabolic processes or movement, and they tend to try to absorb, like the color code tends to affect, the more things that you either absorb or generate will affect how you perceive heat stress. Okay, for example, dairy cows, people talk about, yes, you can be in a tropical condition, but particularly for dairy cows that produces, like these Holstein cows, they produce lots of milk, they produce so much heat because of the amount of food they eat and the amount of milk they produce. there is like lots of these heat stress, the heat stress they feel is actually, and the reason why they like that kind of temperature is because they are always kind of warm, really are. And because of bovine and ruminants, they tend to have the rumen. The rumen is this little fermentation chamber. Produces a lot of heat too. So this is the kind of stuff that, you know, eventually will go. So you go to dairy farms very often, especially in places that are hot, you're going to have fans and sprinklers and misters and all sorts of things to try to alleviate a little bit of the heat of these animals. Like this different types of stress, this is the other part. Like we're talking about thermal stress, okay? But these animals, even in a regular farm, they can be exposed to other types of physical stress, such as injury to the hoof, or psychological or physiological stress. This one here, normally associated with health. Okay, these two here, they normally are associated with health. But yes, if you are there and you all of a sudden the animals do not have access to feed, it's a big problem. The other one there, psychological stress, is the one that didn't used to be very well recognized up until recently. You know, people would say, well, psychological stress an animal might be, but it's very true. Like, you know, the way, for example, they are restrained, or how you are about to view or administer injections, or what kind of new sites inside of the farm you expose them. Are they together with the same group of animals, or are they always introduced to new groups? So they always have to basically go to a group, and it's an animal like any other, and it's a social animal. So if you put them in different groups all the time, you move them a lot, it means that they have to basically reestablish hierarchy every time they go to a new place. And every time they go to a new place, that's a new stress. So that's the kind of stuff that, you know, before perhaps you wouldn't be so much of a concern. Today, as people become more and more aware of those things, and consumers become more and more aware, then you start to change or try to change some of those things. So this is the how, for example, heat stress affect fertility and for example, energy balance. So for energy balance, when I say energy balance, let's say they eat less, they consume, or they consume less energy, they spend more energy because of, and one thing that I didn't mention here, but animals, for example, in heat stress, yeah, they were going to produce, for example, they did a study, a very, very nice study trying to say, when an animal is under heat stress, they are going to produce less milk. And you say, well, they produce less milk because they probably consume less feed. They are not able to produce as much milk. But actually only explains the reduction in feed consumption, only explains about 50% of that reduction. Where do you think the other 50% comes from?
Some of it could be them like not letting their milk down, maybe.
You could. You're right. You're right. You know, just like some sort of psychological stress, and that doesn't trigger, and the milk went down. Could be one.
Will the HPA system prevent circulation of insulin, so you can't take glucose and turn into glycogen and fat, that also affects energy reserve?
So in this case, so you have cortisol. So the cortisol wouldn't allow you to take some of the fat. Is that what it is?
Like the conversion of glucose to fat, so you would lose also body mass alongside of the structure.
So the stuff is almost like this. So if you have cortisol, and the cortisol, for example, doesn't allow glucose to be, in your case, you're saying that it doesn't allow glucose to be converted to fat. But that that would be even better because you would have like free glucose around to be used. You know what I mean? Like, you know, the stuff, like, part of the other 50% is because, you know, they have, for example, increased their respiratory rate. They sweat like crazy, or they try to paint, like cows don't sweat that much, but, you know, and some of these metabolic changes that, you know, the body trying to dissipate heat is what consumes a lot of energy. So this is what explains. In a metabolic, from a metabolic point of view, cortisol tends to have this opposite effect, which is to bring glucose from reserves to the bloodstream. Okay. So glucose in that case will probably accelerate the rate by which the animal loses weight. You know, I think that would be the most important thing from cortisol. You can have, let's say you have something that helps convert glucose into fat. Okay. Normally the stuff that will do that is insulin. Okay. So insulin is the molecule that will then allow glucose to enter the cell. And as you have more glucose in the cell that you can spend energy from, you know, the remaining of the glucose, what you're going to do is you're probably going to repackage in the form of either glycogen, and eventually what you can also do is you break in a certain way, you can start producing fat. Okay? And if you have that, I don't think you would explain that. I don't think it would explain you having less energy or less milk production. Because if you have something like this happening, all of a sudden you end up, the cortisol itself would try to take glucose from the bloodstream that is already lower and to accumulate into adipose tissue. Yes, you say you could explain decrease in milk production by doing that, but that's not what happens.
So like I'm just wondering, does the body use glucose or use the fat to
It uses. This is a very, very good question because for most of the tissues, you do. For example, your brain is almost exclusive of glucose. Like they use almost always only glucose as a source of energy. This is the reason why you need to keep a certain glycemia in circulation. If you become hypoglycemic, what is normally the effect? You become dizzy, you become tired. If you go into extreme hypoglycemia, you can go into sort of convulsion, coma, and stuff because your brain needs only that. To produce milk, for example, because lactose is a major molecule in milk, and lactose is basically galactose is a disaccharide. It's a galactose plus glucose. So you need actually glucose in order to form that. You cannot, even if you get something from fat, you have to have glucose. There are two things that happens with for example, the mammary gland during lactation or the brain is that these two tissues do not need insulin for glucose to come into the cell. They have a way of having their receptors are like they basically don't need insulin. Liver is another tissue that also don't need no insulin to get in because they do. Liver because they process most of the glucose in the beginning. Brain because they need it and they only use glucose for energy, and the mammary gland because they really need glucose to actually produce milk. The other part, so answering to your question is basically this. To produce milk, almost always the body will prioritize the mammary gland with the glucose that you have available. So you can say, yes, majoritarily you're going to need glucose to produce milk. Are you going to need fat? Yes, too. But the mammary gland, the weird thing about the mammary gland is that they are not using, and that's why in nutrition, when you produce milk, the energy requirement for milk is like several times higher than maintenance. Because for maintenance, what you need is to burn those molecules. To burn glucose to generate ATPs to provide energy to you. For the mammary gland, what you do, you package fat and glucose and just dispose it. Like you're not even burning that thing. You're just using that thing and to produce milk. So by the time you produce like 40, 50 kilograms of milk, like one of those high producing cows have actually, the amount of energy that will require, the amount of molecules that are required to produce that amount of milk is like enormous. Enormous. It's like super, super, super high. Going back again to your question, you're going to need both, but in the terms of the mammary gland, the only difference is that you're going to actually need as much glucose as you have. Other tissues, let's say your muscles can actually be deprived of glucose and try to use some fat. Then they go into beta oxidation inside of the mitochondria, and they generate ATP and reducing equivalents such as NADPH and FAD to produce ATPs. Okay, so it depends on the tissue that you're talking about. Mammary gland specifically, glucose. Yeah. Okay, I think we talked too much already. We're gonna go back to end this. I'm gonna actually post also this case study for you. By the time we get back, we might go back to that. We might know. We'll probably go back to that class of the stress. I really apologize. I skipped that thing and I completely